You're listening to the Slavic Literature Pod, your shelf help guide to all things Slavic. I'm Cameron Lalana.
And I'm Matt Gerasimovich.
And you are listening to our read-along of Vasily Grossman's Life and Fate, covering Part 1, Chapter 9. And today we've gone from the relative slowness of the previous two chapters, the relative shortness, to a pretty, saying explosive part seems inappropriate.
And that's because it is.
Yes, the war comes to Chuikov and his staff. So is there anywhere you want to start with this?
Everything is on fire. That's where I'd like to start. A pretty scary chapter, I would say. I wouldn't like to be in that situation by any chance. But what I liked about this chapter, and this is something I really liked about Stalingrad, is that there are these passages that are really beautiful that are interspersed into the war. I don't want to say more so than Tolstoy, but I don't know. They really strike you when you read them, and especially when we're doing this chapter a day format. I do feel like I notice them more. And so the quote that I chose to feature on our Instagram this morning was, talking about how the oil is on the Volga and it's on fire, and it's just, it's like this unbelievable scene, I'm sure to have witnessed. And the quote says, "The life that had reigned hundreds of millions of years before, the terrible life of primeval monsters, had broken out of its deep tombs, howling and roaring, stamping its huge feet. It was devouring everything round about." And I don't know, just the way that Grossman kind of chooses to describe these things. You can describe how big a fire is, but to describe the power of the fire, that it's drawing on the life of these things that had lived millions of years before you. It's really beautiful, I thought. And it's almost strikes you as just out of the ordinary in some ways, or it could. But, to me, he really perfectly kind of wraps these two things together in a way that it doesn't feel out of the ordinary, but it does still strike you at least as beautiful.
Right. And going from the fire, let's go to a comment from one of our users in Discord, Mike Shaw, also known as Puglife890 on Discord, who is talking about the fire. One of the characters starting with Zakharov. Zakharov isn't in the fire, but the possibilities of the disasters taking place at a crucial position that can't be reached is terrifying in its own right. There are obvious strategic implications if the Germans overrun them, but there are, as the end of the chapter shows, emotional connections to the comrades who, for all he knows, have all been incinerated in a horrifying manner. Because I read a few chapters at once, I was reading this emotional display in relation to Mostovskoy's speech in Chapter 6. "Listen, Cossacks," this is quoting Mostovskoy, "everything's fine. Can't you see that? Every day, the state created by Lenin continues to exist as a death blow to fascism. We must hold our heads high." And then it goes on for a little bit. "Zakharov certainly cares about the results, but he cannot adopt a purely ideological frame of mind, where individuals are non-entities fueling the progress of the state, when he can see a hellish from a distance where he can see a hellish sight from a distance where comrades are burning alive." I think this is a good differentiation, right? Where you do see a very interesting line that a lot of people have to walk on the side of the USSR in this war, for people who are in the camps, as we've talked about it pretty at a long extent. But also, even on the front lines, right? We are years away now from the depths of the Yezovshchina, of what we'd call the Great Terror. But even on the front lines, the NKVD is still looking for possibilities of, fifth columnists. Was it fourth columnists or fifth columnists?
Yeah, somebody has a column,
Yeah,
for sure.
Right. Some number of columns down from one, right? Traitors, whatever. And as is noted by biographers of Grossman, being on the front lines where the NKVD were not could sometimes provide a strange sense of freedom for some who the NKVD might have otherwise been paying attention to.
And this is another sort of related point where somebody was asking a little bit about the military ranks. And it can be important to know sort of how the ranks relate to each other. But to me, I think part of the way that the front line is displayed is this almost collapsing of the ranks. I mean, they're still there, obviously, but because of the fact that when you're in battle, things tend to break down, these sort of artificial boundaries sort of break down, it becomes interesting to see how people kind of interact and relate on just this one-to-one basis outside of just their ranks. So this is something that I was thinking about as we're getting to some more, I don't want to call them action scenes, but scenes with action.
Definitely. You also saw that in Stalingrad, where those soldiers fighting in the city itself. I'm thinking of one scene where there's a peasant from who've been following the whole book, and I really need to remember his name. Um, Despite the fact that there is no official officer, he has been such kind of a father figure to everyone there that by the time they need someone to lead them, naturally steps up to that role, not by virtue of being appointed or having the rank, but simply because he has earned that respect from everyone around him.
That is Vavilov, who we will be meeting tomorrow in Life and Fate.
Yes. There we go. Vavilov, our
I
boy.
knew he was coming up shortly, but because we're kind of ahead writing posts, it all gets kind of blurred together. When I read it and then I go back to write and then I go back to read for the day, everything's a blur for me.
Yep. But anyhow, we've got one last comment here. This one's from Leah. It's interesting that the major players in this chapter are historical figures. Did Grossman come to know these men personally in his capacity as a journalist? Are the emotions ascribed to them crafted to fit the narrative, or did he witness some of these reactions firsthand? And okay, so our broad answer here is that we cannot tell you for certain for any particular person. That being said, keep in mind that Grossman was basically the journalist of the Red Star for the USS, for the Red Army. He was one of the Soviet Union's foremost journalists of the war at this time. He was talking to a lot of people. I would say good odds. If he didn't talk to them personally, he certainly was probably pretty familiar with them through other journalists. He was more of a frontline journalist, so I would say the closer that person was to actually fighting on the front lines, the more likely it was that he actually knew them personally. Some of these things he's writing are things that he did see or people he did talk to or things he did hear about. I couldn't speak to Life and Fate as much as I can speak to Stalingrad, right? There are many chapters where there are real commanders who were people he actually knew and he's portraying things that actually happened. Sometimes that did get him into a little bit of trouble. There's a scene in Stalingrad where there's a commander, signing a death warrant in a piece of essentially crayon. And that was not super well loved by the establishment, given that that was a real person and this was a rough reflection of a real event.
We told him to stop using crayon.
Right. And yeah, so it depends on that individual character. For sure, it is definitely possible.
But then again, a lot of the characters in the book are sort of the conglomerate of many of the stories that he wrote about or had heard. So
definitely. I would say it's more likely also that he heard about the reactions or spoke to someone about them rather than witnessing them firsthand for the most part. I mean, you see that in points like, I can't remember if this is a short story, this is from Stalingrad, but there's a commander who, what our Commissar Krimov will go through or did go through in Stalingrad, breaking out through an encirclement of German forces, which is also covered in a short story of his or short book of his, is based on a real commander, which based on all the secondhand accounts, Grossman heard that this man had died. So in the short story, specifically, telling the same story basically under his name, he kills the guy towards the end of the book. But in real life, the guy was actually alive and apparently found it quite amusing that Grossman killed him in a novel. So, just because he heard it doesn't necessarily mean it was true, but it was certainly something that he heard about. These things are possibly things he heard about someone, regardless of whether or not they're true, is the short version of that.
But good questions today. Good discussion today. Back to the grind in Discord.
All right. Well, unless there's anything else you wanted to cover.
No, I'm out.
All right.
I'm retiring.
Great. In that case, we're retiring forever. You heard it here first.
Until tomorrow.
Until tomorrow. That's when you'll hear from us again soon.